All right, grim reality check today we saw with the Treasurer laying out the economic update, including the largest debt numbers we've seen for many, many years. The budget deficit itself has blown out from $85.8 billion last year. It's now forecast to hit $184.5 billion. Expectations that the unemployment rate currently at 7.4% will hit 9.25% before Christmas. I suspect it will be higher, although they're masked in many respects by those JobKeeper payments. And the debt forecast gross debt will reach $851.9 billion this financial year, 45% of GDP. Joining me to make sense of all of these numbers and what they mean for you, former Reserve Bank official, former Chief Economist to the Prime Minister, Dr. Andrew Stone. We work together. I'll declare that at the start. This man is brilliant. Those numbers today in the economic statement, I won't go through them all again, Andrew. There's a lot there. What did you make of them? Were they as bad as you thought?
Okay, Peter. I think they were, well, they could even have been worse. To me, though, I mean, it's difficult to think of the right adjectives to describe this. Eye-watering was used by the Treasurer earlier, and many adjectives. To me, the main point about them, though, is that I would say that they're clarifying. They really are awful numbers. To me, the standout number was actually the net debt figure. So net debt is projected by June next year to have reached, as a percent of the economy, 36% of GDP. And to put that in perspective, we have 50 years' worth of data in the historical tables in the budget papers going right back to 1970. And through that whole 50-year period, net debt has never exceeded about 18 or 19% of the size of the economy, of GDP, annual GDP. So we are, in the space of 15 months, since sort of March through to March this year through to end of June next year, we will have suddenly doubled that level that we've ever had in the last 50 years. And that is a measure of the scale of the costs that we've been taking on. And the reason I used the word clarifying earlier is I think, hopefully, that will make clear, will pave the way for a much more hard-headed conversation about exactly the sorts of trade-offs that we have to make in the way we respond to this pandemic. In particular, if we're running these sorts of debt levels over the space of 15 months, running up to these sorts of debt levels, that's going to mean billions and billions of dollars less spent every year for decades now, going forward now, on health, on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, on education, on all sorts of other government priorities. So we need to have a very hard conversation now, I think, across the nation about whether it is appropriate that we've been spending these enormous sums of money in response to this.
Let me just jump in there, Andrew, because you're touching on a point that was asked in the press conferences today, the Treasurer and the Finance Minister, that they were pushed on whether this now means, and these are only forecast, of course, that these numbers could all get worse, whether that would mean come the October budget that they would start to claw back in terms of spending to remediate, to start to pay back and deal with the deficit. They said, no, it's all about growing the economy, and there was talk of tax cuts and other incentives coming out in October. Is that what you would expect, or would you want to see more hard-headed cost cutting in terms of spending?
Well, it is very difficult. I mean, when you're talking about tax cuts and so forth, the difficulty is, again, if you've run up so much debt, I would always love to see reductions in taxes if they're well directed, but it's difficult because then you're potentially collecting less tax revenue, and so further increasing your debt. I think the critical thing I'd say here is it's absolutely right that the focus must be on increasing growth, and that really goes back to the actual economic response to the pandemic. Was it appropriate to shut down, to lock down the economy? And given what's happening in Victoria now, we have to think very hard if either in Victoria itself or if the case numbers were to spread to other states, would we repeat that sort of lockdown? My own view is that that was actually not the right response, that it was actually a considerable overreaction. What I think the health data shows, and Australia by and large has done very well through this crisis so far, but what the health data shows is that this is a very dangerous disease for people who are elderly, and particularly people who are elderly with serious other health conditions. But for the great bulk of the population, this is not a particularly deadly or dangerous disease. And to put it in context, we're talking about the 5 deaths in Victoria today, and every death is a tragedy. But every day at the moment in winter, in a typical Australian winter, 500 people die. Every day during winter, 10 or more people die of the flu in a typical flu season. So we have to have some perspective here as to whether the sorts of deaths, scale of deaths that we're talking about warrants spending, in this case, adding $270 billion in the space of 15 months to the public debt, when, as I say, that means that you'll be unable to spend that money on all sorts of other things you'd like to.
I understand that point, but I think the anger in Victoria is more related to the fact that this was basically incompetence that got us to this position, and it was entirely avoidable if you look at the circumstances of other states and what's happened there, and Victoria being so wrong-headed, putting bouncers as opposed to army personnel in these hotels have given this consequence. Two assumptions I want to pick up out of the papers today. The first one, it's all predicated, these numbers, and Victoria's a big part of the national economy, on Victoria opening up after only 6 weeks locked down. Now, we're 2 weeks into the 6 weeks. The numbers are meant to be going down at this point. We're going into the third week. They're supposed to be going down. They're not. In fact, they're increasing. So I can't see that we're only talking about a 6-week lockdown. That will change the numbers quite dramatically. They also say in these budget numbers that come the 1st of January next year, well, lo and behold, the doors will open up, we'll have international travel back. That's money, obviously, for tourism and the aviation sector, but more importantly, it's this old issue you and I talk about a lot, it will prime the growth numbers by virtue of migration. Now, I can't see in January that somehow we're going to have dramatic, big levels of immigration safely into Australia. So how much can we even rely upon these numbers out today?
Well, to be fair, so there are some assumptions that I think are optimistic. To be fair, again, about the opening up from 1 January, it is still the case that people coming in will have to undergo a 2-week quarantine. So that means, as far as most tourism goes, people aren't going to want to pay to come to Australia and then sit in a hotel room for a couple of weeks. So, but as you pointed out, a key issue here then relates to overall immigration. Now, I actually think, it's very unfortunate the circumstances in which it's occurred, but it's actually been a tremendously good thing that we will see a significant reduction in immigration, which will allow some of the other pressures in our economy to be sorted out. Nevertheless, in terms of the assumptions that are built in, to be fair, I think the net overseas migration assumption for this current financial year is still only about 31,000. That's only about about 15% of the typical annual level that we've been running, this astronomical annual level that we've been running. So at least they're not assuming a ramp up again to the sort of massive figures, annual figures that we used to be seeing just a couple of years ago.
Just a quick one. The last time we had these sort of comparable levels of debt and deficit was back in the end of the Second World War, so just outside of wartime. How do we pay all that money back in time, and what lessons did history teach us that we need to apply now?
Well, the main thing is we have to be very disciplined now, because we will have to run budget surpluses to pay that debt back. The only alternative, which actually many countries did do after the Second World War, is that you inflate away your debt. So this was true to a degree in Australia, but more particularly true for various European and other countries. What happened it took some time to occur, but what happened particularly in the late 60s and through the 70s was we had a period where we had massive inflation. Double-digit inflation became the norm. And one thing that people found is lots of people who'd saved money and lent it to the government suddenly found that they were being paid back in these inflation devalued dollars. And that's how lots of governments got out of the debt difficulties that they got into. I think a lot of people who are thinking of lending to governments will be much more cautious about those risks now. So I suspect we'll have to do it much more the hard way of actually being disciplined, spending less than we raise in tax revenue and running those surpluses to pay the debt back. And that will be a painful exercise.
Let's see if we've got the intestinal fortitude as a nation to do all of that. Andrew Stone, thank you for your analysis. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Peter.